Welcome to Using Forward Declarations. In this video, we're going to make a barrel elevate method, but that includes the need to create a barrel class, which we will do. And we need to include that barrel class in the tank aiming component, but we're not going to use a hash include this time. We're going to use a forward declaration just so that we can actually change this thing that we hold, this private member for the barrel, from a static mesh component to a barrel, but without doing a hash include. You'll see why in the video. And then in the CPP, we will do the normal hash include, and we'll be logging out to make sure that the tank aiming component can call into the barrel and that the barrel can log to the console like so. So see you in there. Okay, let's have some fun with a barrel class then. I'm going to make a new C++ class, and I'm going to ask myself, what's it going to be based on? Well, as we recently dealt with static mesh components, if you remember, let's just take a look inside the tank aiming component. Where did we do that? Here you go. The set barrel reference was using the static mesh component class, and if you remember that the barrel itself is indeed a static mesh, that's the class we're going to base our barrel.cpp off. It's the most basic class that we can use, and it's very relevant to the barrel. So we're going to add a new C++ class, and it's not going to be in the list. So we're going to need to show all classes and then look for it. There you go, static mesh component there. So let's go ahead. And what do we call this thing? Well, I think it's specifically a tank barrel. Now, Unreal is going to prefix this for us with something. Do you know what it's going to prefix it for us with? Is it going to be U or A? If you're not sure, then it's maybe worth having a quick look at the class viewer and trying to remind yourself what the coding convention is. But anyway, it's going to do one of those two, and it's going to be U because it's ultimately based off component rather than actor. Should be able to show you that, but I think I need to wait until the class has finished compiling before I can do anything with the editor right now. So meanwhile, I notice I've got two Visual Studio windows open, so I'm going to just close one of those. And here we go, tankbarrel.cpp and tankbarrel.h. U tank barrel based off U static mesh component. That's why it's U, because we're coming off a component-based class in the first place. All right, fantastic. So that is the beginnings of this. So we said we needed some properties for the barrel, but I'm tempted, before we put the properties in, to think about what the public method is. So the public interface to this barrel is simply that we can, without a return value, elevate the barrel at some floating point degrees per second. Okay, so that's the public interface, if I could spell elevate correctly. And of course, you're going to write that method. I think it would make sense for me to immediately pop that into the C++ file. Now, look at the C++ file. Has it got everything we need? I think it does. It looks very sparse, but it actually has everything we need. I think it's only going to need to do these includes. So that's fine. Void elevate degrees per second. Of course, we are going to need to pop the class name in here. Okay, great. So now we have an outline for elevating that barrel. Now, some of the code is over here in the tank aiming component. Move the barrel a right amount this frame and give a max elevation speed and the frame time. So I'm going to take those comments, pop it in here, and then I'm just going to call this method, this barrel, elevate that barrel, which IntelliSense hasn't caught up with yet. And I'm going to pass it in a value for testing, which is going to be the end of your challenge anyway, of say 5 degrees per second. That should be easy to see. So to do remove magic number, because we have a magic number of degrees per second here. So we're going to call barrel elevate at 5 degrees per second, and the rest of our work for this video is going to be over here in the tank barrel. But before we go any further and actually write elevate, look, the class uStatic mesh component has no member elevate. What's this talking about? Well, remember that the barrel, when we declared it in the aiming component, which is here, was a uStatic mesh component. But we are now saying that we're going to use, rather than a uStatic mesh component type of barrel, we're actually going to use a barrel class. So we need to make a change here. This needs to be utank barrel in the tank aiming component.h. utank barrel like that. Now, the system doesn't know about tank barrels at this stage. The tank aiming component doesn't know anything about tank barrels. So we need to find a way of telling the aiming component that tank barrels exist. So what we can do is something that we haven't done before, which is something called a forward declaration. We can just say class utank barrel. Now, if you look at that, that's the same as saying class and then all this stuff here, but it's really stripped down. It's something called a forward declaration. And that just allows us to reference the type utank barrel here in the header file. It also makes all of our dependencies very explicit without creating a chain of dependencies. Okay, so we'll start using forward declarations like that more. And this shows that in a given header file, you can actually define more than one C++ class. It doesn't always have to correspond. Usually the name of the class is the same as the name of the file with a prefix, but with this forward declaration, that breaks that pattern, and it's just a feature of C++. Cool, so we now have a utank barrel pointer, barrel, and it starts off as null pointer, which is safe. So now we can actually call barrel elevate on there, which is wonderful. But let's try compiling our code now and see if we actually get as far as this tank barrel code being called. Let's do a UE log. Have I got a UE log waiting over here that I could use? Yeah, let's take this log away from the moved barrel towards. Try and only keep one log at a time if you can help it, unless you're right in the middle of a problem. And then let's just say barrel elevate called. Okay, and we don't need any qualification of that. We could say with speed if we wanted to, at speed %f, and then you could just pass in degrees per second. There you go. Why not do that? Fantastic. Let's see if this compiles and if the information actually gets passed through, given that we've made these structural changes and that the barrel is now, sorry, the tank aiming component's barrel is now a barrel type rather than a static mesh component type. So let's see what the problem is. So in tank aiming component on line 20, it can't convert from a static mesh to a barrel. So let's have a look and see what we need to do there. Okay, now that's because here in the tank aiming component, we need to be talking about, rather than a uStatic mesh component, we need to be talking about a utank barrel, okay? Which makes sense because all of the instances where we were using a plain static mesh component, we're now using a barrel, which is a derivation of, a child of the static mesh component. But that means, of course, we've got to do a bit of work in the tank aiming component. Let me just do a search in the current project for uStatic mesh component, without regex and without case sensitivity. Now it can't find any references to that. Just in case you wonder whether I spelt it right, I could cut and paste there. And you can see that the only place it exists is in this set barrel reference, okay? So it's just here that we need to change it. So utank barrel in the tank CPP, and then let's go and see where else it was. And that'll also be in the tank.h, of course. Utank barrel. Right, now, in the tank.h, again, it has no concept of a tank barrel type. Okay, in a moment, when IntelliSense catches up, it'll complain about that. So what I want you to do is a micro challenge is pause the video, make a forward declaration here in the tank.h for the tank barrel type. One thing I should say is if you decide to try and compile your code and make the game run during this challenge, you're going to have a problem because the tank blueprint has got an issue in it that we will be fixing in the next lecture. That's to do with the fact the tank blueprint is expecting a barrel versus a static mesh, which we are changing in this lecture, but we will fix in the next. So just watch through the end of the lecture and watch the next lecture if you're actually trying to compile and run your game. Okay, so it's simply a question of saying class utank barrel in here, and that will work fine. So now it understands what this type is. How about in the tank C++ when we call utank barrel like this? Is this going to be okay? Well, let's do a compile and see what it complains about. So the basic point is that in a header file, if you need access to a type, then you just use a class, a forward declaration. By the way, you can put that word class somewhere else. You can actually put it on the line in question, but I'm not going to confuse you with that at the moment. It's better that we do our classes at the very top for the moment, just to keep things simple. So we should get another complaint, I think, from the compiler now, as it says that on tank aiming component 20, it can't make a conversion. So that's just because I didn't change it to utank barrel. Let's go recompile. So it's a bit of a hassle refactoring it like this, but it wouldn't have made much sense for me to show you this as a tank barrel type, because that would have mean I needed to set up the tank barrel far too early. It's only at this very stage now that we even need a tank barrel. So this is a good time to be doing it. Now, what do we get when we compile this time? Let's try, see what happens. It's interesting to see the compiler errors because when you start doing forward declarations for the first time, you're going to get these. Okay, so in tank Emmy component 19, it is not liking, it thinks something that is overloaded. Well, let's check the tank aiming component.h and we need to change the type there. So these are the sort of things that happen if you don't carefully refactor and change all of your references. And it's part of this is the syntactic noise in C++ of having to change things both in the header file and the C++ file. So we've still got an IntelliSense error here. I think that will lead to a compilation error. Let's take a look and see what it says. So now we get to the point I wanted to make, which is that in the tank aiming component C++ now, it doesn't understand the type. Now we can't just do a forward declaration here because we actually are going to be calling a method on the barrel, which is here, barrel get socket location. If we need to call a method, then you actually need to include it. So it's at this point we do need to do a full hash include in the C++ file of tank, what's it actually called? Tank barrel.h. All right, now let's try and see if that'll compile. So I hope you get the difference here. Basically, in a header file, all it needs to do is know that that type exists, and by going class and putting in an empty type definition, then that keeps the compiler happy as far as the header file is concerned without creating a chain of includes. Whereas in the C++ file, of course, to actually use a class, you need all of that class's code available when we get down here and actually call methods, barrel get socket location, and that's where we need to do the full hash include. So this is just some good practice for you. I'm going to close that window so I don't keep clicking on the wrong one. And I think that hotly reload worked. Here you go. Barrel elevate called at speed 5. Great. So little bit of thinking for you there, a little bit of new stuff about forward declarations and classes, but we have the outline now of a barrel, and we can now start filling in the private properties that we're going to need in the barrel, which we'll do in the next video. And we have ourselves a new type in the tank aiming component, the utank barrel. So we've moved away from the static mesh, and we'll use the same sort of thing for the turret, of course. We'll be having a utank turret type, and we are now ready to go ahead and code out that tank barrel method. So I shall see you in the next video.